of triumph, and she finally opened her eyes to gaze at me. She crushed her lips to mine, pushing her chest into my hands, and willing me to grip them more firmly. And I did. I also groaned into her mouth as I began groping her, and pressing against her tongue. Just fucking praying that she wouldn't start writhing against my erection as she straddled me. We stayed up a little later that night. I knew she wanted to feel it for longer. Her victory, and the proof that the process was working. So I continued massaging, and pressing against her peaks as she licked and sucked her way up and down my neck, and back to my lips breathlessly. I eventually let the kisses dwindle to soft slow pecks as I decreased the pressure on her breasts with my hands, and finally removed them to stroke her cheeks and hair. She understood what I was doing, and eventually climbed off of me with one last kiss and a smile that made me chuckle. She was still smiling into my chest as she humped me to sleep, and I smelled all of her flowers and cookies in her hair. It was a good night for my girl. And I did get to grope her, so really, I couldn't find any room for complaints either. I began changing positions up, trying to find the one she liked the best. I learned so fucking much about my girl. Little things that were important. She liked it when I nibbled her earlobe gently. And in return, she'd nibble mine, and I'd groan into her neck. There were also things that made her say the safe word. Shit that I didn't expect. One night I had chosen the position where I was on top. She seemed to enjoy it a lot as we fought against each other's tongues breathlessly, and she shifted her little hips against mine. Then she began pulling my hair. My scalp was sore from the previous night, and I really didn't want it so soon. But instead of saying the safe word, I reached my hand up and grabbed her wrist, tugging it gently away from my hair, and sighing in relief as I lowered it beside her head. I don't know why I did it, but I kept hold of her wrist as I broke from her lips panting, and began kissing my way down her neck as she writhed against me. Then I lifted her wrist overhead, and held it tightly above her. She stiffened underneath me, ceasing her writhing.
Cookie.
She choked while tugging on her wrist. I let go of her wrist and shot up so fucking fast that it made my head spin a little. I panted as I sat on my knees between her legs, rubbing up and down her thighs, and glancing at her apologetically, as we caught our breath. I ended the night there, feeling really shitty for doing something as stupid and careless as trying to assume a position of dominance over my girl. I should have known that it would make her uncomfortable. I was careful after that, usually allowing her to remain on top of me, and trying to show her subconscious that she was, in fact, the dominant one. And the groping continued. She was always so fucking eager for the process to start every night, sometimes breaking away from my lips and silently begging me to begin before I was ready. The cookies and relaxing became gradually less and less time-consuming, giving us more time every night to enjoy the feel of her breast in my hands. It didn't escape my notice that she began wearing lighter sweaters. It was nightly battle with her mind's will, and we were steadily breaking down that barrier with every touch and grab. Panting at each other, and hornier, and all hell, as we kissed relentlessly, and pulled each other closer with moans and groans. The process was slow as fuck. But we eventually made it. 30 days. One whole month of the process on her chest. And I was finally able to grab them in my hands, without one cookie whatsoever.
Bella's point of view. I was straddling his lap, leaning my forehead against his with my eyes closed, completely relaxed, and trying with everything in me to contain the massive squeal that was in serious danger of bursting forth. He was groping my breasts without needing the technique. And there was no panic or discomfort of any sort. I couldn't help the wide grin that slowly spread on my face as he gripped them more firmly. He chuckled softly in front of me, washing my face in his warm breath as he massaged my breasts. I sighed, and opened my eyes, meeting his gaze as I stroked his hair softly. I felt so alive. So victorious and triumphant as I crushed my lips to his eagerly and pressed his face closer to mine. He smiled against my lips and eased himself back onto the pillows, bringing me down with him as I plunged my tongue into his mouth, and he continued squeezing my breasts. It had to have been the best night of the whole month. A ridiculously difficult hurdle. and if my butt was any indication of what the technique accomplished, then we wouldn't need it for my breasts anymore. And that thought made me skip to the bathroom when it was time for bed. It had been a long 30 days. I had been counting and mentally documenting every detail of every night inside my mind. Edward was a freaking saint. Because my self-control left the room 28 days ago, I borrowed his most of the time, using it to restrain myself from touching him the way I did in the meadow that day. Edward had my safe words to keep him in check every night. I didn't have that luxury. There was nothing stopping me from touching him, and hearing those sounds again. Dignity and virtue were sorely overrated. I could feel him against me every night when we got into bed. He was aroused because of me every night. Even the nights we didn't make out and we just talked about things that made us cry. We were still turned on by the feel of each other when we pressed our bodies close under the covers. I was wondering how he handled it. All the pent-up sexual frustration that it all caused. I certainly couldn't complain, because he was doing it all for me because of me, but I was curious as to how he could even function some nights. I had so much trouble pushing the lust back most times. Of course, there were nights where the lust was pushed back all on its own. Sometimes I'd be down when I came over, obsessing over something that had happened that day. And he would just hold me and let me cry, listening to my problems, no matter how trivial, and always making me feel better by the end of the night. The days at school were still hard to get through, but having Edward by my side at every possible moment made it bearable. He walked with me through the halls, glaring at people, and sometimes tensing up over something that would upset him. I'd just squeeze his waist tighter and whisper that I loved him to the floor as we walked. It seemed to relax him. Lunch became my favorite time of the school day. I was able to scoot as close to Edward as I wanted with my hood down as he put his arm around my shoulder and I stroked his knee. Jasper, Rose, and I could talk about historical biographies. I was more timid about talking directly to Jasper, but I did have a good time talking to Rose. It always bothered me that we lacked any common interests, yet still called ourselves friends because of our mutual association with Alice. I began making her a bag of cookies that first day I spoke to her. She was snarky, and she disliked my first and second favorite guys. But she was the closest thing I had to a girlfriend that wasn't in direct blood relation to me, and I didn't want her to feel left out when we all had a bag of cookies, and she didn't. The next day when I gave her the cookies at the lunch table, she made a comment about how they would make her fat. But I could see the corner of her lip twitch as she opened the bag and began eating them with the rest of us. I nearly crapped myself when Edward and Alice began talking. I was so scared when it all began, wishing I could disappear into Edward's leather jacket as I anticipated World War III of the Forks High lunchroom. But instead they compared mutual musical interests. It was appalling. It was divine. Watching them agree on something without grudges or glowers. They smiled at each other every time they hit on something the other liked. Even flesh-eating bacteria couldn't ruin the mood it put me in. And at the end of the day when I got into the Porsche with Alice, she actually complimented me for finding a man with good taste in music. I gaped at her as she smiled on the drive home. I had been wondering what would break her for weeks. And that was it. And every other day after that in the lunchroom, Alice wouldn't glare at Edward. Instead she would occasionally ask him a question about some new album or insult his clothing. For Alice, that was a good thing. I told him so as we walked to biology, just so he would understand how endearing her clothing ridicule was. It made him chuckle and shake his head as I squeezed his waist tighter with a wide grin. I never let Jim get me in low spirits. No matter how often Jessica would glare at me or James would hide from me, I tried my best to shake it all off. Counting down the minutes until the bell rang and I could walk out the doors to meet Edward, who was always waiting for me with a crooked smile. The ride home with Alice became more comfortable as I was finally able to gradually introduce my relationship with Edward into our conversations. I always kept the topics light. his favorite kinds of cookies, how much he liked my cooking, how sweet